Are you already in 2 Timothy? I trust that you are. We're going to go to chapter 1. Now I'm starting. Now I'm clocked in. This is official now. And I want to read tonight in verse number 15 of chapter 1. And I want to read down through verse 18. And I'm going to pray and then we'll dive into the message tonight. Paul said, "This thou knowest, that all they which are in Asia be turned away from me, of whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes." At least that's how we're saying it tonight. Y'all say amen. It may be different when we revisit this text. Just play along, okay? "The Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft refreshed me, and was not ashamed of my chain. But when he was in Rome, he sought me out very diligently, and found me." I just got a blessing right there. "The Lord grant unto him that he may find mercy of the Lord in that day. And in how many things he ministered unto me at Ephesus, thou knowest very well." Father, it is a joy. It's the joy of my life to stand tonight and have your word in my possession. I thank you for this church, Lord. I know it's just a Thursday maybe to some. But Lord, what it does for my heart to see people that are faithful, to see people that are committed, to see people that are in love with you. And they manifest that in their schedule and in their priorities. Lord, bless them tonight. And may we bless you. God, you see the tired bodies. You see the troubled minds. You even see the worried and anxious spirits that may be sitting in these pews that I don't see. And Lord, I pray that for the effort and God for the labor of love, the commitment that they have demonstrated, I ask you to bless them greatly in return in this night's service. I'll thank you for it, and it's in Jesus' name. Amen. Last week we looked at verse number 15, but we did not look at it in its entirety. We did not look at these two characters that are mentioned at the end of verse 15. And I wanted to dedicate a message to these verses as a whole. And I want to walk through them, and I pray that you'll see what the Lord has allowed me to see. I want you to notice, first of all, I want you to see the fallout that Paul experienced. The fallout that he experienced. We touched on verse 15 last week. "This thou knowest, that all," everybody say all. Come on now. All they which are in Asia be turned away from me, of whom are Phygellus and Hermogenes. Now, there is a fallout that has happened in the life of the Apostle Paul. Paul was abandoned because of his stand on the gospel. I want to give us a word of warning tonight. I want you to lean in. When you experience abandonment, when people withdraw from you, when relationships are severed, we need to be very careful that we examine ourselves before we make bold statements about being martyrs in the faith. There is a possibility that you're just a jerk. Everybody all right? There is a possibility you're just a bad friend. Every situation does not mean you are a martyr of the faith. It could be that there is responsibility on our end. And sometimes we get this complex like we're suffering for Jesus, but often it is not that we're suffering for Jesus. We have mismanaged our relationships. And we ought to be careful of that. That's easy to do. It's easy to feel like, well, other people are not spiritual and that's why they're not walking with me. And that may happen, but we owe it to ourselves and we owe it to our friends and we owe it to God to examine ourselves when relationships are severed and be honest about the cause of that dissent. How many of you have separated from somebody because they robbed you of joy and they robbed you of energy and they left you spiritually depleted? You don't have to raise your hand, but you can if you want to. I'm just going to do this right here. I'm going to sever. I'm making up for several. All right, now, how many of us would also admit that there's probably people who separated from us at times because we were not bringing to that relationship what we should have? But Paul here is very careful to let us know that this is not a mismanagement of his friendships. But the reason that there is a fallout is because of his stand on the gospel. And here's what I want to say. If I am carnally or selfishly the source of separation, I ought to humble myself and fix that. If you're too proud to apologize, you need to humble your heart and find the strength to say, I was wrong and I'm sorry. I don't know. I think sometimes we overlook that part of our walk with God. But Mom and Daddy, if you're doing it right, there'll be times when you have to apologize to your children because we don't always handle things right. You can get proud and not show your weakness to them and, go with the old, well, I'm the parent, that's why. But you're going to raise little people that's going to grow up to be just like you. And it does not hurt to exhibit humility. If we are the fault, then we ought to humble ourselves and apologize. But if I am being abandoned for the gospel's sake, then so be it. If my walk with God is the reason that we cannot be friends, then we just cannot be friends. If my attempt to live holy, if my desire to be honorable to God is cause for separation, then separation it is, because we must be true to Him above all others. I'm going to say this and I'm going to move along, but how many of you know that if you really stand for the truth, there will be a price to pay in this world? Everybody's not going to want to hang out with you. Everybody's not going to want to be your friend. I had a guy not long ago said, preacher, I got saved. And he said, but man, he said, that old crowd that I used to run with, he said, they won't leave me alone. I said, well, I can help you with that. When they come over, instead of a beer, have a Bible. When they call to ask you to go out, tell them, oh, I can't go with y'all, but I'm going to church in the morning. Would you like to come with me? When they show up and they start in on all that they do, you just start talking about how good God has been. Give Him your testimony about how you got saved. Listen to this little country preacher. You won't have to get rid of them. They'll get rid of you. They'll lose your number quick and in a hurry. Some of y'all have lived that. You don't need to be a jerk. And you don't need to try to be, superior, act like you're better than them. But if your walk with God is the reason for separation, then so be it. And Paul is experiencing that. Now, the fallout here is perplexing because these are saints in Asia that wept when he left them. Acts chapter 20 and verse 37 says, when Paul was leaving, and they all wept sore and fell on Paul's neck and kissed him. They wept when Paul left, but now the people that wept are leaving him. And it is perplexing. I touched on this last week, and I want to just pass by it again. It is a devastating thing when the people that got you to God are no longer walking with God. That hurts. It's confusing. When people that told you you needed Jesus and you came to church and got Jesus, and now they're back out living where you were when they told you you needed this. It's perplexing. It is perplexing how people can be with you, and then as much as they were with you, they will withdraw from you. This fallout is perplexing. This fallout is painful. You know, when he needed them the most, they helped him the least. Paul is alone. He is on trial. His life is hanging in the balance. He is being held in a damp, dark prison. And the pain of this abandonment is so intense that it causes him to speak in hyperbole, and he says, all of those in Asia have forsaken me. We know that is hyperbole because certainly not all in Asia forsook him. There are churches that would arise in the Bible and in history out of that area in Asia. There are saints that would later be mentioned that went on for the glory of God. But Paul was in so much pain, and Paul was in so much hurt over those that were not standing with him that it blurred the clarity of his vision. And I think that if you and I walk through that same experience, we will feel the pain of abandonment when people that should be for you are nowhere to be found. I wrote this down, so let me say it like I wrote it. Sometimes, listen, lean in. Sometimes when we do not hear others stand for us, we think that they are standing against us. Listen very carefully. Omission is not always opposition. I'm going to say it again. I'm going to say all that again. When we don't hear others standing up for us, in our minds we'll start to think they're standing against us. And I want you to understand that omission does not always translate into opposition. In other words, just because you can't hear them cheering for you doesn't mean that they're cheering against you. Does that make sense? The leaders in Asia were silent, and they should have spoken up. And I believe that's who these two fellas were that he mentions. I believe they were prominent church leaders. And Paul's saying, hey, those two clowns should have come to my aid. They should have stood with me, but they did not. I don't think he's calling out church members. I don't think he's calling out average Joes that are saved and in the family of God. I think these are men who had a biblical responsibility to stand publicly with Paul for the gospel's sake. And so sometimes when we don't hear people's support, we don't hear them cheering for us, we'll think that they are against us. And certainly these two should have been more outspoken. But I have a question. How many unnamed saints were still praying for the great Apostle Paul? Hey, how many believers in Asia were going to bed every night believing God to carry Paul through that trial? How many children who looked up to that man of God would have gladly stood with him, but they had no money to travel, they had no means to communicate, and because voices were not heard, Paul translated it into complete abandonment, and what was omission is now in his heart opposition. Here's what I want to tell you. Just because everybody's not cheering for you does not mean they're cheering against you. Sometimes people don't know what to say. Sometimes people feel like it's not their place to say it. Sometimes people are afraid to approach you and they don't want to make it worse than it already is. But the devil will tell you they don't care about you. Nobody loves you. Nobody's there for you. I want to tell you the devil's a liar. And for every one of the sorry people that are not doing what they should, there may be 100 others in the shadows who are still for you. They just don't know how to say it. They don't know how to say it. We'll let the devil go to work on our mind. I've heard people say, nobody at that church likes me. And I want to ask them, man, nobody? Did you ask everybody? How did you come to that information? And oftentimes it's because they're going through stuff that nobody even knows they're going through. But the lack of vocalized support, they translate it into silent opposition. And I think that we have to be very careful. And I'm not preaching against Paul here, but I think there's a real warning here that we don't become so swallowed up in speaking in such a large context that we really get outside the realms of reality, because it is very obvious that there were still faithful people in Asia and there were sorry people in Asia who were not supporting Paul, but you cannot throw everyone out because some are not doing what they should. And that was painful for Paul. This fallout was painful, but it was also personal. Did you notice what he said? And I think this is important. He said, verse 15, that they be turned away from me. From me. Now let's be honest. These people had an accountability to God for their treatment of the gospel. They had an accountability to God for not standing up for the doctrines of Christ as revealed through the Apostle Paul. But when they failed to stand for those, they also failed to stand for Paul. And Paul took that personal. Is everybody plugged in tonight? Everybody good? Everybody's hearing aid on? Everybody's good? Everybody got just enough coffee to help you get through this and make it to the bed tonight, all right? Caffeine's still just barely clicking you up the track there going up the hill. I want you to listen very carefully. The reality is they were not abandoning Paul. They were abandoning the repercussions of Paul's gospel. What Paul's preaching was outlawed. He was fixing to pay the ultimate price for this bootleg religion that he was producing. Now, it was from heaven, but it was not sanctioned by the government. So these people are afraid that they're going to get what Paul's got coming to him, and they're really going silent on the gospel, but it hurt Paul personally. And I don't know if we're going to get past point one. That seems to be a theme on these Thursday nights. But here's what I want you to see. Some of the people that will walk out of your life, it really is not about you. It is about the work of God. Backslid folk ain't got no interest in hanging out with people that are excited about the things of God. Carnal Christians who want a little bit of Jesus on Sunday and a whole lot of the world the rest of the week, they have no interest in fellowshipping with somebody who wants to walk in the light day and night, and we want him as close on Friday as he is on Sunday. Carnal Christians have no desire to be yoked up with somebody like that. And they're really not taking a stand against you. They're taking a stand against the gospel. But here's what I'm trying to show you, is it hurt Paul personally. It hurt him personally. It's sitting poor, pitiful me, and I'm not going to whine, and I don't want you to take it whining, okay? God has been better than me than I could ever ask or deserve. But I've had people leave church, get out of church, walk away from God or just leave this church, and they say things like, listen, it's nothing personal. But it is personal. Because you love them. And you pray for them. And you invest in them. And you encourage them. And you pull them along. And you push them along. And you have them in your home. And you open up your heart to their friendship. And you, if you've been in as long as some of us have, you don't even want to do that because you know how this could end. But you do it anyway, and then it ends the way you thought it would end. And it hurts. And it's painful. And it's perplexing how people that was ready to fight with you can instantly be ready to fight against you. And it is a confusing, perplexing matter. And that's where Paul is. He said, they've turned from me. And it hurt him personally. Have you experienced that kind of fallout in your walk with God? Where others forsook Him, but it took a painful toll in your life personally? Maybe your answer is no. I hope that it stays no. It is a painful thing to be abandoned in the work of the Lord when you are standing for truth and for right. There's more I'd like to say about that, but I'm going to wait till we get there in chapter 4. So there's a fallout. And he's experienced it. But I'm thankful that when others walk away, somebody help me preach, God will often have another walk in where somebody walked out. He said, in verse number 15, Phygellus and Hermogenes, they did not stand. But instantly he says, but the Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft refreshed me, and was not ashamed of my chain. But when he was in Rome, he sought me out very diligently, and found me. When others walk away, God is prone to bring another in their place. You know, the Bible lists no specific callings around the life of Onesiphorus. It does not tell us his talents, his skills, or his ministry abilities. The Bible does not say that Onesiphorus was the best male soloist at the church. It does not say that he was a rousing teacher of the gospel. The Bible does not tell us that he had deep pockets and gave big in the offering. Do you know what Onesiphorus was? He is recorded as nothing more than being a faithful friend. A friend that was faithful. A friend that walked in while others were walking out. A friend that stood when others were silent. Thank God, what an inspiration for me and what an inspiration for you. If there's anything all of us can be, it is faithful, and we can be a friend to people that are trying to serve God. When you get here Sunday, I want you to look around at who's here. I don't believe, and even tonight, I don't believe that anybody comes to church here by accident. I don't believe anybody comes here just because they had nothing better to do. But I believe that people come to this place because they're longing to walk with God. Some of them leave an abusive spouse at home, and they come to church with a heart to serve God. There's young people that leave a home of dysfunction, and they come to this place with a heart to serve God. Don't look past them. Don't look over them. They may not look like you. They may not dress like you. They may not have what you have. They may not like the things you like, but they are seeking to follow Him. And the greatest thing you'll ever be is a faithful friend to a child of God who is pressing on for His glory. When you are faithful, the faithful are blessed. Paul prayed for God to bless Onesiphorus and his house. Look in verse number 16. The Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus. Somebody help me preach right here. Paul prayed a blessing of mercy on Onesiphorus' family. He wasn't praying for the brick and mortar. He was praying for his family. And the faithfulness of this man impacted his family. It brought them into the inner circle of Paul's ministry. And when Paul is closing this same letter, he said, salute Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Because of the faith of Onesiphorus, his family was ushered deep into the work of God. Mom and Daddy, it matters whether you serve God or not. It matters whether you go to church or not. It matters whether you try to live right or not. There is an entire household around you that will either be pushed away from Him or drawn to Him based on our faithfulness. On our faithfulness. Paul prayed for his family, Onesiphorus' family, to have mercy. You know what mercy is? It's tenderness. Paul said, God, I want you to deal with his house tenderly. I want you to be real easy with them. Be compassionate with them. How many of you want God to be merciful to your house, to your family? Paul prayed a blessing of mercy on Onesiphorus himself. Look in verse number 18. He prayed that in verse 16 for his house. Verse 18, the Lord grant unto him that he may find mercy of the Lord in that day. See, he was not only blessed in his family, but he was blessed personally. Paul prayed for him. Said, God, give him mercy in that day. And that three little word phrase, in that day, this could refer to several things. This could refer to the day of his death, when Onesiphorus steps out of earth into heaven, when he steps out of time and into eternity. It could refer to the day of his death. It could refer to the judgment seat of Christ, where he would receive the reward of his labor, and God gives him the crowns of his work. He could have been saying, God, be merciful to him. Give him mercy as you be kind to him as you reward him for his labor. Or it could just mean in the day that he needs it. We don't know what it means. In that day. But there's one thing about it. I want mercy in every one of those days. And if the great apostle Paul is going to pray for me and ask God to give me tender compassion and be gentle with me in that day, I don't care if he's talking about the day I die. I don't care if he's talking about the day I receive my reward. I don't care if he's talking about the day that I'll need it the most. I want the blessing that comes from being a faithful friend. Do you want that tonight? The faithful are blessed, but the faithful are a blessing. Verse number 16. He said, the Lord give mercy unto the house of Onesiphorus, for he oft, O-F-T, he oft. That word means many times. This was not a one-time deal. Many times. He oft refreshed me. Look at me right here. That word refreshed, the literal translation, means to cool off. You ever heard said about somebody, or maybe you've said it about somebody, they're like a glass of cold water. They're like a glass of cool water. They're like a breath of fresh air. What are we saying? They are refreshing. You ever been around somebody that just literally was like that when you were in their presence? No, y'all haven't. Me and Brother Buddy have. Don't tell them who our friends are, bud. They don't deserve people like that, apparently. We'll let God decide if y'all get to experience that. You ever been around somebody like that? You just leave them different. You just leave them happier. You just leave them with a little bit of a lighter heart. That's what Onesiphorus was. And it wasn't just once in a while. Y'all ever bump into somebody and you're afraid to ask them how they're doing because they might just tell you? You just wave, act like you're on the phone. Yeah. Scared to death. They might unleash on you. Well, Onesiphorus wasn't that way. He was a breath of fresh air. He was a glass of cold water in a hot desert of suffering. And Paul said, He refreshed me. I want to be refreshing to other people. Don't you? And here's what he did. Paul said he was a blessing because he was not ashamed of my chain. Now here's why he would have been ashamed of that chain. Paul was on trial. Paul was indicted for being a Christian. And anybody that was associated with him was going to be guilty by association. But Onesiphorus did not care. He was unashamed to be labeled with Paul. I like Onesiphorus. The whole Christian world is laying low and being quiet. And Onesiphorus goes to Rome, knocks on the door of the palace and says, I'm looking for the Apostle Paul. I'm looking for that one y'all locked up for preaching the gospel. Well, what are you looking for him for? Because he's my friend. He's my preacher. He's the man that told me that I did not have to go to hell through the grace and the mercy of Christ. Onesiphorus was not an undercover Christian. He got up every morning, drank a big glass of don't give a rip, and walked into Rome and said, I'm one of them. I belong with him. He's my preacher. That's my friend. We believe the same thing. He was unashamed of Paul's stand. He was a faithful friend, and he was unashamed. Verse 17, he is a blessing. And this choked me up when I was reading it in the text. Because when he was in Rome, he sought me out very diligently. And this is the part that got me. And found me. You know, great effort was given by Onesiphorus to actually find Paul. You know, he could have went to Rome and went to one of the believers he knew and said, hey, no, well, if you see him, tell him I said hey. And then he could have went back home and said, you know, I tried to find him when I was up there. He could have just give some little bitty effort and write it off like I tried. But this man didn't just try with lip service. He diligently sought for Paul until he found him. He said, I'm not leaving till I put my hands on his hands. I'm not leaving till I can take him some food in that dungeon. I'm not leaving till I can pray for him like he's prayed for me. He sought him out diligently. We ought to, hey, if you've got a friend that seeks you out in your times of trouble and they don't give up on you and they don't do it just to say they've done it, but they really try and they put in the effort to be a help and a blessing, you ought to thank God for friends like that who are not just doing it with lip service. Mission accomplished. He found it. Now I'm going to say this and I'm done. It's interesting that, look at the end. Look, it's right here, verse number 18. Look at the end of it. And you know in how many things he ministered unto me at Ephesus, thou knowest very well. Here's what that means. That means before all this started, Onesiphorus was still a breath of fresh air. He was still a refreshing glass of cold water. I'm going to say something. I know y'all tired and you're checking out on me and all that stuff, but check back in for just a second. You be very leery of people who run into your problems and they only show up when life is difficult. You need to be very cautious about people who run in your tragedies. Because real friends don't run in your tragedy. They were there before the tragedy ever broke out. I'm preaching now. Y'all can zone out, whatever. I'm going to finish this little thought. I am leery of, there are people who thrive on drama. There are people that will not come sit on your porch and fellowship with you while you're blessed, but you end up in the hospital, you end up in divorce, you end up with a rebellious child, and they'll come over and bless your heart. Honey, how are you making it? And I got news for you. If they didn't give a rip about you before this, they don't give a rip about you now. They are seeking to ride the wave of your trouble, and they are there for how it makes them feel, not for how they can make you feel. I thought this might happen. Amen, preacher. That's exactly right. Thank you, sir. God bless you. I've seen enough of that stuff to make me want to throw up. Won't walk across that aisle, shake your hand, but you let trouble come and they'll be down there in your living room, stay for 3 days. I prefer friends who were there in Ephesus. I prefer friends who were bringing me a glass of cold water when there was no drama. Thank God for an Onesiphorus. He's not doing it to get some kind of emotional buzz off of what he's doing for you. He's just a servant of the Lord who said, I loved Paul when there was no heat, and I love him now that he's in the oven. That's my man. That's my friend. That's my preacher. That's my fellow minister. What a faithful friend. Now, here's my third thought. I want you to notice the focus that Paul exemplified. We said the faithful that Paul encountered and the fallout that Paul experienced. But I want you to notice the focus that Paul exemplified. This is it. Verse 15, Phygellus and Hermogenes, they turned away. Okay? Paul gave those cowards half of a Bible verse. He gave them half a verse and mentioned that they were cowards. But when he mentions the courageous of the house of Onesiphorus, he gives them 3 whole Bible verses. When he references the weaklings, he gives them 6 words. When he references the warrior of his faithful friend, he gives him 67 words. Do you see Paul's focus? Yes, people are going to walk away. Yes, people are going to go silent when you're struggling. Yes, people are not going to be there when you was there for them. They're going to let you down. But Paul was not focused on who was not there. Paul spent his energy focused on who was there. And that's a choice you'll have to make. You can spend all your life talking about how your mom and daddy didn't love you and how your siblings mistreated you and how you've never had any friends that were ever really faithful to you. Or you could realize the person you're saying all that to has been there through all of it. Naomi in the Old Testament. Naomi lost a husband. She lost 2 sons to death, a husband and 2 sons to death. And then she had a daughter-in-law who forsook her. And she was left with Ruth. And she could have spent the rest of her life talking about, how dare they. But instead, the one that was left carried her into the greatest, most unbelievable chapters of her life. And it's a choice you're going to have to make. It is, I'm telling you, as sure as I'm standing here, that is a choice you're going to have to make, to walk in the bitterness of who didn't show up or walk in the blessing of people that have just been faithful. I'm not preaching tonight to hear the sound of my own voice. I've been trying to preach it 30 minutes, and I've been doing real good at it. And I am not trying to preach tonight just to say stuff. I preach about it every night. I'm not looking for a place to just say stuff. The Holy Ghost of God is trying to help somebody in here tonight. There are people in this building that God has given you a mama, a daddy. He has given you children. He has given you a spouse. He has given you a church family that has loved you unconditionally. And you have been depressed and down in the mully grubs about things that happened 20 years ago, and all around you are faithful friends who would love to love you, but you're not allowing love to be accepted because you're hung up on those two that left me instead of recognizing the Onesiphorus that is still here. Not a person in this building hadn't been let down. Not a person in this building hadn't let somebody down. But boy, I've got more that stood with me than those that stood against me. I've got people that's never changed. They've just never changed. We may not be as close as we once was, but they've never changed. If I needed them tonight, I could call them. And we ought not overlook that. You ought not overlook an Onesiphorus who's just faithful right on. And just so bent out of shape on the dropouts that you fail to thank God for the faithful friends. That's exactly right. And not only should we be thankful for them, we ought to go on our face tonight and ask God to help us to be one. To be one. To be one. Everybody wants one, but don't nobody want to be one. Well, I think y'all do want to be one. I shouldn't have said it like that. I think that's our heart tonight. Boy, when you stand before the Lord, He's going to be way more interested in how faithful you were than how you sang, how much you gave, what you could or couldn't do in the kingdom of God. He's going to be way more interested in your faithfulness than all that other foolishness. I don't even want any music tonight. Here's what I want us to do. I want us to come find a place on this altar and say, Lord, get my heart out of this ditch of despair. And Lord, make me aware of just really how good you've been. And God, help me to be thankful for the people you've put in my life that have stood the test of time.